People clown on Quest 64, including people who genuinely like it, and it's easy to see why. After all, look at this little guy. His hair has jiggle physics. Look at him go. He's so fast. People are hard on Holy Magic Century, and as someone who enjoyed playing it growing up, I wanted to see just how justified the many criticisms levied against it are. So I set aside 2 afternoons and played the whole thing, taking notes along the way. Since finishing the game, I learned a bit more about just how rushed and unfinished Quest 64 was and is, but I'm not here to talk about what this game isn't or could have been. This is about the game we got. Let's start with the obvious, the graphics. You've been looking at the game for a bit, so you can probably tell that it's actually quite good looking. It's bright and colorful when it wants to be, and dark and somber when it needs to be. Pah! Let me know when you want to play a real RPG. And yes, I connected my N64 to Steam. I'm very elite like that. NPCs don't look too great, however, especially compared to the Fire concept art. Still, they're charming in that derpy kind of way. Enemy designs range from just a dragon to what the hell is that thing. Even generic enemies like orcs and mimics have unique aspects to their appearance. Brian has a simple look, with hair that puts Alfalfa to shame. I like Brian. He has an air of youthful exuberance about him. He runs fast with his cape flying behind him, showing no signs of fear, exuding determination. Just like protagonists of other quest-likes such as Undertale do. The only thing I'm more illiterate in than graphics is music, so all I can say is it slaps, mostly. There's the boundless optimism of the overworld themes, the serenity of the monastery, the majesty of the castles. It all works so very well. Is it as good as its contemporary Final Fantasy VII? No, of course not. But what is? If you ignore the boring opening cinematic, which I am, you are thrust right into the game. Protagonist Brian just told the abbot he was leaving the monastery to go after his father, who's been missing for a month. You see, some absolute bastard stole the Eltale book, and Brian's dad Bart went out to retrieve it. The Eltale book is the only reason the kingdoms of Keltland are at peace. And if it falls into the wrong hands, a calamity called Day of Grief will threaten to plunge the world into chaos. I hope you liked the story of Quest 64 so far, because there really isn't much more than this. They'll be traveling from town to town and solving their problem by defeating their respective fopdoodle who stole that settlement's magical elemental orb. We got fire, earth, wind, and water. And yes, it is that generic. NPCs don't fare much better, with most of them only having 1 or 2 text boxes at most. There's a mom who wants her daughter to be a singer, and a dad who just wants her to do whatever she likes. There's no quest or character development attached to this at all, but it's memorable because it's one of the few sets of characters who don't just talk about A, the orb being gone, or B, the problems caused by the orb being gone. The story has an underlying theme of balance between the elements, and it's the thieves' misuse of the orbs that causes all kinds of inconveniences. So for example, you need to retrieve the water and wind orbs before you're able to continue travel by boat, as the wind and waves are simply not cooperating. It makes enough sense to provide the player with immediate, easy-to-understand goals while not exactly being intellectually stimulating. The whole balance of the elements thing is kinda whack though, for reasons I'll go into in a second. Being a magician's apprentice, Brian mainly relies on magic in and out of battle. The spells you cast are split into 4 elements, and when you gain a level up you choose one of them to increase in power, starting at 1 and going all the way up to 50. With every level, spells of that element become slightly stronger, with new magics being unlocked at certain milestones. These range from magic missiles, fireballs, and big dumb boulders to healing, silencing, and at least 3 flavors of painful air. The problem here is that the healing spell is absolutely vital, and you only get and improve it by leveling water. By the end of the game, you're likely to have around 110 to 120-ish levels, which means you can't go beast mode in all 4 elements. If you want your spell's damage to keep up with enemies' growing health pools, you're going to want to specialize. If your Earth is at level 1, it doesn't matter how many levels you've gained in total, your Earth magic will deal the same amount of damage it did at the very beginning of the game. Since healing is a water spell, you already have to invest a decent chunk of your levels on water, so you might as well go all in. Late game bosses deal so much unavoidable damage that only a level 50 heal can restore more HP than you're losing every turn, and healing items have their own problems unique to Quest 64. Point being, roughly half of your total level ups pretty much have to go into water if you don't want to grind for several days. The rest you are free to distribute as you see fit. In theory, but in practice there's an earth spell that renders you invincible for a few turns, and it barely costs any MP. The most powerful spell, Avalanche, is also an earth spell, making that element an even easier choice. So if you're a casual quest enjoyer, water and earth are the way to go. So much for that whole balance of the elements garbage. But while we're on the subject of spells, let's talk about what I think most will agree Quest's best feature is. The combat. In battle, you and your enemies move freely around the field during their turn, with each fight actually taking place on the exact terrain of the encounter. Be careful though, because different foes are the most dangerous at different ranges. Man-eater plants, for instance, will slowly heal themselves while you're out of their immediate attack range and only pose a threat up close. Every standard enemy has a small selection of the same spells you can learn, which has 2 excellent side effects. For one, if you already know a spell, you'll likely know where its blind spots are. The rock spell launches a boulder from above the caster forward in an arc, and you quickly learn that standing too close to the enemy will cause you to miss every time. Use that knowledge against your opponents to potentially avoid damage entirely. Secondly, if you don't know a spell yet, it might make you go, "Oh dude, triple fireball fucking wrecked me up close, I wanna learn that shit," to give you that bit of growth to look forward to. Given the game's shortcomings, I honestly kinda doubt the second upside was intentional, but it's there, and it's good. You're given the chance to move during enemy attacks to avoid them, which adds a nice execution challenge to the otherwise tactics-based proceedings, in theory. There are 2 major problems with this feature, however. Most attacks at melee range cannot be dodged. You only regain control shortly after the cast animation plays, at which point it will likely be too late. On top of that, most long-range spells are either homing projectiles or move so fast they might as well be instantaneous. This is a huge shame, since later quest-likes do a better job in the singular aspect and nothing else. So dodging attacks isn't nearly as much of a feature as it appears at first, but tactical positioning remains important for most fights, setting it apart from most other titles in the genre. Fights are fast and don't waste any time. You know how Final Fantasy VII's most powerful spells can take up literal minutes? Well, a level 3 spell in Quest, the highest level, is just as snappy as your starting spells. Many of the later spells are upgraded in terms of utility and coverage rather than damage. Water Pillars 1 to 3 all deal the same damage, but they get drastically larger and taller with each upgrade. This is actually kinda clever. It rewards the player for correct positioning that would allow them to hit multiple targets with the cheapest possible spell, rather than making the pricey spells the correct choice every time. Fireball and Wind Cutter function differently as they launch additional projectiles at higher levels. Here you get to decide whether to launch them from afar to let them spread out and hit multiple targets, or use them up close to focus damage on a single monster. I like that the different elements play differently. It would have been easy to just have 4 colors worth of do 30 damage spells, but they went the extra mile, making each element feel unique. Look, my point is combat is fun. The action is fast-paced, positioning is vital, different spells vary in effectiveness not only based on elemental weaknesses but on enemy formations, and it generally bucks the trend of being a brainless mash A through at random encounters affair. No sir, in Quest you mash C buttons. Selecting spells is another interesting piece of innovation. Your C buttons are each matched to an element. Press 1 to initiate casting a basic spell, or press up to 2 additional buttons to go further down the spell tree. Want to heal? That's water into earth. Want to cast Drain Magic? That's water followed by earth and fire in any order. This is actually kinda brilliant. When a single character learns dozens of spells in any other RPG, get ready to scroll through clumsy menus. In Quest, every single spell is at most 3 button presses away. Sure, they had to sacrifice 4 out of the 6 face buttons, but damn it, it's worth it. Even way back in the day, this spell system struck me as positively inspired. You're playing a mage after all, dedicating half the total inputs to magic is only appropriate. Another small but important feature are those little spirit bubbles you find bubbling in the overworld. These are rendered from great distances, making them easy to spot, and collecting them will instantly grant you a full level up to spend on an element. This constantly encourages exploration since they're incredibly valuable regardless of playstyle. Aside from magic experience, there are a few more stats that gain XP separately from one another. HP slowly increase as you take damage and attack with your staff. You also get a juicy bonus for taking out bosses. MP regenerate rapidly while traveling around the overworld. Max MP are raised even more slowly by casting spell. Interestingly, casting healing while at max HP does not grant MP XP, and thank God for that. Otherwise, casting healing, walking 3 steps, and casting healing and walking 3 steps would be the optimal way to play. Defense XP is earned every time you take damage. The more recklessly you play, the better equipped Brian becomes at dealing with your Unga Bunga playstyle. Agility determines the likelihood of enemy attacks missing. This is leveled up by walking around and whenever an attack misses you. You could absolutely set your N64 to 10,000% speed, go to a safe area and run in circles for a bit to turn yourself into a dodge monster relatively quickly. In theory, this would lead to every copy of Brian being personalized, but in practice he just gradually becomes stronger based on your enemy's actions rather than your own. I don't mind this method of leveling up your passive stats, but it doesn't offer a lot of agency. That just leaves one RPG mainstay left to discuss: items and equipment. Well, there is no equipment, so that's easy. Items are found in treasure chests and from defeating enemies, and there's no money to buy more. Items only drop from enemies if you don't already have one of that type, which is a weird system, but I guess keeps you from amassing a bunch and using them in every battle. Because if you keep items, you miss out on drops, but you don't need the drops if you keep the items, but you don't get anything out of having items if you don't use them. So sometimes use items even though you have no idea if you'll ever find another one, I guess. When you get knocked out, you don't reload a save, you just return to the last place you saved, with any items you've used remaining lost. There are some very nice people in every town who will give you free healing and teleportation items, but again only if you don't have one of that type already. This more or less works, since gold really is just a middleman if you think about it. Theoretically, this also stops the player from stockpiling a ton of healing items and spamming them in boss battles, which is a good idea. In actuality, if you level water, you'll have plenty of renewable healing via magic, so you'll end up with an inventory full of bread and potions anyway. And here's one last tiny complaint. There's a unique consumable wings item used for fast travel to every town in the game. You get it for free from a specific NPC at each location, so every time you teleport, the first thing you should do is pick up some new wings for the place you just traveled to. Why then make the wings consumable at all? It's no challenge to restock, it just wastes a couple seconds. Really not a big deal, just a minor annoyance with the potential of becoming a major annoyance if you accidentally teleport to an earlier town without having the item needed to travel back to where you left off. Luckily, you only have to backtrack one single time, so you're unlikely to make that mistake. So that was a bit of a roller coaster, but overall I think Quest 64 is mostly ranging from kinda bad to genuinely good. Sure, the game can be beaten in under 10 hours, which wasn't great value as RPGs went back in the day. Sure, its story is simplistic with next to nothing going on. Sure, it lacks the polished, complex mechanics seen in other RPGs, but as baby's first fantasy RPG, it's actually perfectly serviceable. It looks and sounds great. Combat keeps you engaged through its fast pace. Your choices when leveling up are limited, but don't interrupt the flow of exploration. Spirit bubbles are an incredibly straightforward way to keep rewarding the player for taking the time and looking around, and I'm honestly shocked more games don't have a similar system in place. And the spell tree system is bordering on genius. Seriously, developers, rip it off. Magicka did, and that was well received, exclusively for that reason, I'm sure. Does this mean you should spend $800 on a boxed copy? Yes.